Okay, so next on the pyramid here above adherence, the first one we're going to talk about is volume, particularly volume, looking at total sets and then how that relates to intensity. We talked about frequency in the previous video, in the first video, when we looked at how we split up our body parts, our movements, and how we set our training days. So when we look at volume, we're looking at sets, and volume refers to the total working sets that you're doing, and this can be per workout. And we also can look at per week, so you only might be working out once a week for that same particular body part, or you might be working out multiple times in that week, maybe twice for that body part. So we're looking at total week, and then you're also considering it in terms of your periodization. Now, periodization is a concept that we don't get into a lot into this particular class, but it is part of mostly like athletic training where you have different cycles, seasons. Basically, as we'll talk about at the end of this lecture, looking at design variation to maximize output. There is a linear relationship that exists between sets and progress. And so when you look at this, you would say, okay, 5 sets a week is better than 2 sets a week, and 9 sets a week is better than 2, and then 10 sets a week is better than 5. The problem with this is that, so you would think that like 12 sets, 15 sets, 20 sets are great. The problem is that this is not a linear aspect. It starts linear, like this, where you see this improvement, but it becomes a law of diminishing returns shortly after. That when you see that the amount of sets, the volume that you're doing does increase, but then you get to a point where it plateaus and then you actually become counterproductive. So you can spend a lot of time in the gym working out and not getting as many results as you would if you worked out a little bit less in terms of that volume. So the way we look at this is that up to about 10 sets is about our limit per session per muscle group, and this is a starting point because everyone's slightly different. The more advanced you are, the more you might be able to tolerate, the more rested you are. So depending upon what else is going on in your life, your genetics, your nutrition, your sleep, your commitments, how you handle things, you might be able to tolerate more stress. But as I mentioned in the previous video, we want to be conservative and end more on this side of the curve. And so our optimal stimulus is going to be between that 8 to 10 set range, right? And again, a starting point. Now this is sets per session per muscle group, so this is per workout, about 10 working sets. This is not really including your warm-up sets unless they are heavy warm-up sets. And you always have to consider redundancy as well. Like, are you doing chest and shoulders in in the same day? Well, it's very hard to not do shoulders and include chest and vice versa. So 10 sets plus or minus. Remember, less is more. Start with less and see how that works out. If you're making progress, don't mess with it. So this is looking at training volume per workout. We also look at training volume per muscle group per week. So if you're doing pushing movements and you're training out twice a week, you could tolerate up to 20 sets. And so it's between 9 and 18 sets is optimal. Just make sure you're considering how you have your program design, where if you have any overlap, if for whatever reason you have dedicated shoulder day, keep in mind that that's there. So now why you start to get this diminishing returns on the sets is because of fatigue mechanisms within the body. And so you get these two aspects, and I'm going to go forward one slide and come back. But you have central fatigue here that's looking at the central nervous system based on overall stress, stimulus, cardiovascular demand. And then you have peripheral or local fatigue that is looking at the muscle aspect. And so we're very familiar with this peripheral fatigue, right? The burn that you feel, the metabolic aspect. That's why you build in rest and recovery sets in between, some longer versus others, depending upon which part of the tissue you're trying to recuperate. But we get this accumulation of stress in the central nervous system more globally, if you want to look at it that way, and it eventually leads to decreased performance, decreased output. So you have these physiological, biomechanical aspects that are part of protective mechanisms in the body, part of normal physiological responses. The central fatigue aspect, your body's performance from all aspects starts to decrease, like your body's ability to produce force, metabolic outputs, and then if it goes on long enough, like immune function, blood cell production. And so this is where we start to get into that overreaching, overtraining, and then injury. The peripheral fatigue is more straight up in the muscle tissue itself. This can be lactate accumulation, ATP, or ADP aspect, creatine phosphate depletion. These are all the biochemical aspects that are happening more at the muscular level. So here, what we look at is this inability for the cross bridges to form. And if you remember from from KIN 230. Force or muscle tension output is a product of both the quality and the quantity of the cross bridges. And if you start to impair that from the peripheral fatigue, you're not going to be able to generate as much tension. The central fatigue is coming more from the spine and the brain and spinal cord, and it affects that motor recruitment, thus the motor drive. You're going to get decreased motor output due to the metabolic byproducts, and you have this feedback mechanism that's happening within the body. And if the body feels like there's some kind of stress or something going on, it's going to start to impair muscle output. So sensory feedback is not just information sent to the nervous system. The body uses that, and it can influence total output. So basically, you want to be strategic with the stress that you're applying to the body. And so you get this concept of like junk sets versus effective sets. And so when you have these submaximal loads, you are increasing metabolic output. You're using muscle tissue that's contributing overall to central fatigue, but not necessarily contributing to overall the stimulus that you want. So this is where the train smarter, not harder comes into effect. This is where you are trying, like you're still under the clock for the time. I know we talk in class about the hormonal responses from that, but there's this whole other mechanism of fatiguing cascades that occur. And so if you can get in, get out, get home, get recuperating, you're going to end up on the other side of that recovery in terms of that optimal volume. So again, 8 to 10 sets is what you're shooting for, and you want to be here on the conservative side of this instead of over here down that overtraining. So it kind of breaks out the amount of sets for depending upon what goal you're looking for. And this is again out of your textbook, what goal you're looking at for, and then what we're going to get into is the repetitions.